Well, thank you, Dan, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. 5 miners suffered horrendous burns in an explosion at the Anglo-American Grosvenor coal mine in Queensland in 2020. They were lucky to survive. They were very seriously burnt. The only reason they survived really is because they were evacuated to a hospital, a country hospital, where there just happened to be a medical specialist at the time who was able to deal with their burns, stabilise their burns so that they could then be transferred to a burns unit in Brisbane. Had she not been there, probably most or all of those 5 would have died. So I just mention that because this is the reality that we're dealing with. This is a very serious matter. So in this presentation, I want to identify a series of ways in which Grosvenor management failed to manage the risk of explosion. They're all interrelated, so I think there's 7 or 8 points I want to make. They're all interrelated, and the result was this explosion. I want to identify the lessons which we can draw from this explosion, lessons relevant to coal mining, but not just coal mining. They're relevant to any industry or enterprise which is dealing with major accident risk or major hazard, which is at risk of a major accident event. That includes all kinds of mining. It includes oil and gas. It includes power generation. It includes aircraft, aviation. The reason why I can cover all of those is because the basic causes of these things are all organisational. They're not technical. Each of these environments has a separate set of technical considerations, but the fundamental causes of what is going wrong are organisational. I should say I'm a sociologist. That's my background, and I've done a lot of research on the causes of these major accidents. So as I go along, I want to raise a series of questions. Challenge you, I suppose, to get you to challenge yourself with these questions, and more particularly get you to challenge your senior managers with these questions. And then finally, I want to offer what I think is a solution to this problem. It's a tentative suggestion, and I'd be very interested in any kind of comments that you might want to make to me about this, either in question time or if you want to email me. I'll give you my email address at the end of the presentation, where you could engage with me, if you like, about the last points that I'm making about the causes of this accident. Okay, now the presentation is based upon a book that I wrote, Sacrificing Safety, The Lessons for Chief Executives. And you can already see from that title that it's the organisational and managerial levels where I see the most significant lessons arising. So the book is based upon, my presentation is based upon that book, plus the report of the Board of Inquiry. There was a major Board of Inquiry into this accident, its report, and also the transcript of that Board of Inquiry. So that's what this is all based upon. Okay, so the first issue I want to talk about is what I call the safety paradox. And that is this, that these managers at Grosvenor Mine honestly believed that safety was their top priority, that they never sacrificed safety for production. And they made these sort of comments to the Board of Inquiry: safety and production go hand in hand. Safety is non-negotiable. Safety is part of our DNA. They hammered those sorts of statements, and I have no reason to disbelieve them. I'm happy to take them face value. At face value, this is what they believed about themselves. Yet, they were mining in very gassy coal seams. They hadn't adequately degassed the target seam they were mining in. They hadn't degassed adequately the seam above or the seam below, all of which needed to be drained if they were going to mine that seam safely. They hadn't done that properly. And the result was this: when they started mining that seam, a great deal of gas would be released in the process and would likely overwhelm the mine with the volume of gas being produced, which is exactly what happened. they assumed that the ventilation system would be adequate to take care of the gas which was being produced and would remove it as quickly as was necessary. But they're actually mining too quickly to achieve that outcome, and the mine did fill up with gas. And the result was that the miners were exposed to unacceptable levels of gas, unacceptable risks, and the Board of Inquiry did indeed conclude that the coal mine workers were repeatedly subject to an unacceptable level of risk. So that's what's going on at this mine. So the question is, how could these managers be so blind to what was probably the most significant kind of risk which was confronting the mine? How could they be so blind to that aspect of safety, whereas they were very focused on, if you like, personal safety? And the answer is we need to distinguish very clearly between personal safety and major accident risk. And that distinction, this is a point that applies to, not only to mining, it applies to oil and gas industry, that they all make this distinction, and then they all focus on personal safety, and they tend to ignore major accident risk. And major accident risk was simply beyond the field of vision of those managers who said safety is our top priority. The most significant risk was just beyond their field of vision. So I'll just make a few points about this. Why is it that there's such a focus on personal safety? Well, it's because the simplest and easiest measure of safety is injury rates. We all know that. They are compiled, they have to be reported in all kinds of ways, and they're easily available, and it's a simple and obvious measure of safety, and therefore it is widely used as the primary measure of safety. The other thing about injuries is that they occur relatively frequently. So we can talk about an injury rate, the number of injuries per million man-hours or whatever it may be, and we can decide whether the rate is going up or down, is the mine getting safer or less safe. So that's an important factor, that they're occurring frequently enough for us to be able to make those kinds of conclusions. The other thing about injury rates is that they're what I would call context-free. They're independent of the particular technology or the particular mine site. We can all talk about injury rates and everybody understands what that means, and we can then make comparisons between mines, between industries, and make positive or negative conclusions on the basis of those comparisons. And finally, boards. When boards say they're interested in safety, they want some simple metrics, simple figures, and injury rates are what they look for. So there's an enormous pressure on everybody to focus on those injury rates. But the fact of the matter is that major accidents are very rare, and injury rates tell us nothing about how well those major accident risks are being managed. Because most mines will go for years and years without having a major accident, and there's just no way of counting the number of major accidents and saying somehow that is an indication of the risk which we face. And it's partly for that reason I think that most of the safety specialists being employed by mines are focusing on personal safety, not on major accident risk. And so this is the first question I think I'd like you to think about yourselves and address to your senior managers. Are the efforts of your safety specialists primarily focused on personal injury, or is there an equal focus on major accident risk? The second point I want to make follows on from that. If injury rate is not a measure of major accident risk, what can we do about that? And the answer is in terms of precursors or warning signs. The fact is that before every major accident, there are always warning signs that something is amiss, warning signs which, had they been identified, responded to, would have prevented that accident from happening. And I say that's true for every major accident that I've ever looked at. There are these warning signs. The other way of talking about warning signs is precursor, that there are precursor events. These are events which occur before a major accident happens. They're always there before the major accident happens, but not all precursor events result in a major accident. So there are many more precursor events than there are major accidents. And that's what gives the power to this idea that because of the frequency of the precursor events, they're a better indicator of how well you're managing the risk than is the number of major accidents itself. Now, years ago, the oil and gas industry recognised this, and they looked, what's their most feared event? Well, it's an explosion, usually a gas explosion or a major oil fire. What's the precursor event to such an event in, say, in a refining industry? It is the loss of containment of gas or oil from the pipes or the tanks in which it is supposed to be contained. So those losses of containment are precursor events. Before any major fire, there is such a loss of containment, but not all losses of containment will lead to those fires. It depends upon whether there's an ignition source present, depends on a variety of things. But clearly, by reducing the number of losses of containment, you're reducing the risk of having that kind of major accident. Now, the whole industry, oil and gas industry, recognises that now, both the owners of enterprises and the regulators, and they focus on the numbers of losses of containments. And if you look at the annual reports of these companies, you'll see they list the numbers of significant losses of containments which they've experienced over the year. So there is a real accurate and meaningful indicator of the level of major accident risk to which they are exposed. How about underground coal mining? Well, one of the worst imaginable events is a methane gas explosion. And as we all know, when the methane is between 5 and 15% in the atmosphere, it's explosive. And the hope is that the ventilation will handle that level of gas and keep it always well below 5%. And if it rises to 2.5% or more, then this is dangerous, and miners must stop. The mining must stop, and miners must withdraw. Now, I'm speaking about Queensland in particular. I imagine it's pretty similar in New South Wales, but I can't be certain of that. But the same principles will apply in New South Wales. And when the gas levels rise above 2.5%, that is called an exceedance. And you can see that's a warning sign, that is a precursor event. Not all exceedances result in explosions, but all explosions are preceded by some kind of exceedance. And the point about them is that they are an indication that your ventilation system is not coping with the amount of gas which is being produced in the mine. So the legislation in Queensland and I think in New South Wales requires that these exceedances are reported as HPIs, high potential incidents. Now, the interesting thing is that Anglo-American did not regard these exceedances as HPIs. It complied with the law by reporting them to the regulator, but it did not regard them as high potential incidents, and it did not include them in its own HPI reporting system. They had a reporting system, and they took seriously whatever they classified as HPIs. They tried to drive down the number of HPIs, but exceedances were not treated as HPIs by Anglo-American. Nevertheless, they are precursors, and they should have been dealt with much more seriously. Anglo had a much higher rate, or Grosvenor had a much higher rate of exceedances than other mines in Queensland. This should have raised loud alarm bells. There were clear indication that the risk was not under control. And if the inspectorate had taken the view that I do, they should have stopped mining and stopped the mining until those risks had been brought adequately under control. Because this is such an important idea, this idea of a precursor, I just want to give you one more example of this from another industry, air traffic control. Air traffic control. What's the worst imaginable accident for an air traffic control organisation? It's a mid-air collision. They occur very rarely, so you can't really talk about a rate of mid-air collisions that any one air traffic control organisation is responsible for, but there are important precursor events. Air traffic control is intended to keep aircraft a certain distance apart. That's their job. And sometimes those aircraft get closer together than they are supposed to be. And that is called a breakdown of separation. It doesn't mean that the aircraft were dangerously close together, but they were closer together than they should have been. There was something wrong in the system which allowed them to be closer than they should have been. So the Air Traffic Control Organisation, it's called Air Services Australia in this country, monitors closely the number of these breakdowns of separation. And if that number is increasing, they know that something is getting worse. Their risk management is getting worse, and they jump on this very quickly. So the point here then, and the question I want you to think about is, what precursor events can you identify in your operations that could serve as indicators of how well you're managing your major accident risks? And as I keep saying, these precursor events will be specific to the site, to the hazard, and they can't be generalised easily across industries or even across sites. So they're not very useful for making inter-industry or inter-site comparisons, but they're extremely useful for ensuring safety at any particular site. So what are the indicators that you might be able to use in this way at your sites as how indicating how well you're managing the major accident risks at your site? And again, I invite you to put these to your senior managers and get them to think about these things, because you must engage your senior managers in all of this. If you don't, then you won't get very far, unfortunately. The next point that I'd like to make here, it relates to incentive payments. This is another thing that contributed to the Anglo-American accident. Anglo was a global corporation headquartered in London, and they had decreed that they had a burning ambition. That was their language. We have a burning ambition to increase our profits and our production by a certain amount across the whole corporation. In the case of Anglo-American, the Australian business unit, the coal mining operation, the aim was to increase production of coal by 50% in 3 years. That was the burning ambition. This was what was driving these people in the way that they behaved. And what that meant was that mining machinery would need to work faster and for longer hours, and they would probably need to start work on seams that hadn't been properly drained. There were production targets set for the miners themselves, certain amount of progress in mining, certain number of metres or feet per day or per week. And if they reached the target level, they'd get a certain bonus. If they worked beyond that, they'd get a significantly higher bonus. And if they fell below that, they got a slightly smaller bonus, not a big drop in their bonus, but a drop in the bonus, not enough to dishearten them, but enough to make them try harder. It was a cleverly designed bonus system to encourage the workforce to work as hard as as fast as they possibly could in cutting coal. Now, safety did not figure in the miners' bonuses. The bonuses were entirely a function of the quantity of coal cut. There was nothing in those bonuses for the miners themselves in terms of accident rates, and there was certainly nothing in relation to major accident risk, nothing to incentivise them to reduce the number of exceedances, for example. And the mine managers, likewise, were incentivised primarily on the basis of the production being produced by the mine. But there was also a component for injury rates, keeping that figure down, but there was nothing in relation to managing exceedances. And so these then were the circumstances which led Grosvenor to mine faster and cut coal at a faster rate than the drainage and ventilation systems could cope with, leading ultimately to disaster. So this is really a very important question that you should put to your senior managers. How could you modify your bonus system to reward the good management of major hazard risk? It's not enough to say, if a major accident occurs, it will cost those managers dearly, because those major accidents are rare. They need to be incentivised on an annual basis on how well they are managing risks on an annual basis, even though there may not have been any major accidents occurring for years. So that's the question. That's the question which needs to be confronted, and unfortunately, most companies don't confront that adequately. Let me move to risk assessments. This is one of the tools for dealing with major accident risk, and it's required by regulation. The problem is that risk means different things to different people. And for most of us in this room, for most safety professionals, for most legislators, for most regulators, most workers, risk means safety risk. But for companies, it means commercial risk. It means economic risk. And this was true at Grosvenor. And that distinction is not adequately understood and not responded to. So when Grosvenor says it's doing risk assessments, they are commercial risk assessments. They are not, and those sort of assessments are useless in terms of managing major accident risk. So some of their risk assessments at Grosvenor, commercial risk assessments, didn't even mention the risk of explosion as one of the risks to be considered. That was not actually on their agenda as something, because it was assumed to be quite rare and therefore is not going to impact on production rates in the normal course of events. So what was the most serious risk which Grosvenor faced? In one of the risk assessments which I saw, this was the most serious risk, that gas concentrations prevent the operation of face equipment. Now you might think that on first sight that looks like a safety concern, but clearly it's not. It's not that we're worried about the risk of an explosion. We're not going to get anywhere near that, because if we get to 2.5%, we've got to stop operations, and that's the risk, and that will impact on production. So this statement here is a very clear statement that the most serious risk to production is these exceedances. And that's the way we're viewing exceedances. They're a commercial risk, not a safety risk. And that kind of attitude, I've seen it time and time again, where in many companies, in many industries, that where most people are thinking of risk as meaning safety risk, the companies themselves are thinking about commercial risk. That's what they're concerned about. And that's what their board is concerned about. The most recent example of this that I've looked at is the Boeing aircraft manufacturing company. After they had 2 Boeing crashes in 2018, 2019, what they were concerned about was not the risk to the passengers, not the safety risk, but what was going to be the impact on company profit. That was their concern. And it took them a long time, it took the board a long time before they began to focus on safety and to realise that these aircraft were indeed not safe and something needed to be done. So the question then is this, do your risk assessments identify and prioritise catastrophic safety risks? And it's astonishing that so many of these risk assessments don't do that. Now, the next topic here, these are all related, as I said before, is critical controls. This is pretty much now a universal strategy in all major accident industries, that what we need to do is, first of all, identify the major accident events which can confront the industry. What are the most feared events? I like to use that expression. What are the most feared events? That makes it a bit more realistic. So what are the most feared events that confront this site or this industry? And then we need to construct causal pathways to show how these things can occur. I imagine that nearly all of you will have seen these kinds of so-called bow ties. And the idea is you've got an unwanted event there in the middle, and the left you've got some causes. And then if left uncontrolled, those causes can result in that unwanted event. So we need to have controls on those causal lines, preventative controls. If by chance they all fail and the unwanted event occurs, then we want to try and minimise or mitigate the consequences. So there need to be controls on those lines on the right-hand side of the diagram. This is just a classic diagram that we can find it operating in most industries. Not only so, you then have to identify the controls, but most importantly, you must think hard about a means for ensuring that those controls are performing as intended, a means to verify that they are performing as intended. And when you think about what that means is those controls have to be pretty specific so that you can say, yes, they're working, or no, they're not. More general kinds of things, such as plans, management systems, policies, are too general to be classified as controls, because it's impossible to say, yes, it's working, or no, it's not. The answer will always be it's working to some extent. And that's not what you need. You've got to have a very specific cutting point where you can say, yes, the control is working, or no, it's not. Now, Anglo was committed to this critical controls strategy. Some of its engineers had been instrumental in getting the International Council for Mining and Metals to introduce this as an industry standard. So Anglo was committed to it, but it didn't work at all. And part of the reason it didn't work is because they didn't take seriously this notion of specificity. They said, what is our plan? What is our control? Oh, we have a plan to control the build-up of gas. We have a plan in place. That's not a control. So it had then, let me be quite specific about this. It had one of these, it had a list of priority unwanted events, as on the screen there. Priority unwanted events. And one of these priority unwanted events was methane gas explosions. So what were the critical controls for methane gas explosions? Well, there was some for ignition control. I won't bother with those now. But for preventing the build-up of gas in the first place, there was only one control, and that was dilution through ventilation. That was the nominated specified control, dilution through ventilation. No performance measures, no indication of how we're going to decide whether this control is working or not. Now, strangely, there was a control owner for the ventilation system, and he audited the ventilation system once a quarter and provided, I'm not sure, the questions were quite general kinds of questions, and provided the results were satisfactory, then the controls were assumed to be operating effectively. And despite these audits, Grosvenor mine was having a string of exceedances. I've forgotten how many there were per year, but there would have been well over 10 or a dozen exceedances in a year. This clearly demonstrated there can be no other conclusion except that the occurrence of these exceedances demonstrated that the controls were not operating effectively. That's almost a matter of logic. But nobody at Grosvenor drew that conclusion. That clearly meant the controls were not working, but nobody drew that conclusion. So here's some questions you might like to think about. Are your bow ties intelligible to all employees, up to and including senior managers? They need to be. Senior managers need to understand why this is so important and what's going on here. And then, are the performance standards for these critical controls clearly specified? How do you know when they're failing? And what happens when they are found to have failed? Do you stop work? Or do you say, oh, well, we'll wait until we get onto the next panel. We'll leave things as they are until we get through this current stage of mining, and then we'll consider it for the next stage of mining. We defer any action on it in that way. If that's the response, when a control fails, you can hardly claim it is a critical control. So, related to this again is the issue of incident investigation. Anglo did accident investigations, which were called learning from incidents, LFIs, learning from incidents. And they did an LFI after every exceedance. every exceedance. Even though, remember, they didn't regard exceedances as HPIs, they nevertheless did learning from incident investigations. I don't know why they did, but that's what they did. And these investigations often concluded that the real problem, why they were occurring, is that the methane drainage and ventilation was less than adequate. Several times they drew this conclusion with their investigations. In fact, so often did they use this expression less than adequate that it was abbreviated to LTA. So this was the fundamental cause of these incidents, that the methane drainage and ventilation was less than adequate. But the inference that follows from that is that the critical controls had failed to maintain the required level of methane dilution. But that inference was never drawn. It was never drawn. That logical conclusion was never drawn. And it was even worse than that. The incident investigation form asked explicitly about critical control failures. And the people who filled out those forms, their explicit answer was nil or not applicable. We have had no critical control failures. There are no critical control failures involved in these exceedances. How can you possibly draw that conclusion in the face of the evidence? And the following people signed off on these reports: the head of underground operations, the general manager for the mine, the underground mine manager, the HSE manager. All these people signed off on these reports, and none of them recognised this inherent illogicality of saying that we haven't had any critical control failures, even though the drainage and the ventilation is inadequate. Okay, so I have to say I was quite horrified by this catalogue of things which I discovered in the course of my inquiries. So the questions I think which we need to think about would be these. Do your senior executives take responsibility for the quality of the incident investigations? That's really important, because otherwise you get this kind of nonsense which was going on at Anglo American, at Grosvenor, because the senior managers hadn't taken responsibility for the quality of those incident investigations. And that's the first thing they have to take responsibility for. And the second is, are they committed to acting on the findings? And sometimes they were and sometimes they weren't. In particular, they would say, we'll defer this matter until we finish the current stage of mining, and when we start on the next panel, we'll try and do something about it, which is clearly not a way, as I said before, the way to handle the failure of a critical control. The next related topic here is principal hazard management plans. Now, this is the language I think is used. This language is used in Queensland, and I'm not sure whether you use it in New South Wales. I think you do. But it all began in 1994 after the Maura coal mine explosion in Queensland that killed 11 people. And at that stage, the government recognised we need a new form of legislation which is not focused exclusively on detailed prescriptive requirements, but rather on management plans, and holds management responsible for adequately managing their major accident risks. And so the idea was that every mine must identify its principal hazards. Well, actually, this legislation often identified it for them. But once they've been identified, the mine was responsible for building a principal hazard management plan for each of those hazards. So this principal hazard management plan was a centrepiece of the new regulatory regime. And these days, all high hazard industries operate in a similar way. They're required to have plans to deal with specific hazards. You might have heard of the expression safety case. This is something which is widely used in the oil and gas industry and in some other industries, but it's just another variation on this idea of the requirement that management of each site must have a plan to manage those principal hazards. Okay, so Grosvenor had a principal hazard management plan for explosions. They had such a thing. It was supposed to be audited internally every year and externally every 3 years. But those audits that whole process must have failed because they didn't pick up that just how badly this particular hazard was being managed at Grosvenor. Here's what the auditors were instructed to do in the Principal Hazard Management Plan for explosions. Obtain and review the last 12 months of reportable gas limit exceedances from the inspector, from the regulator. From a trending perspective, what do the statistics show regarding failure rates and areas of concern? What control strategies have been implemented, and are explosive levels of gas being effectively managed? This is what the auditor was required to do. Now, Grosvenor had many more, as I've said, many more exceedances than other Queensland mines, and the data clearly showed that the explosive levels of gas were not being effectively managed. But somehow or other, the audit process failed to highlight this or bring it to anybody's attention. It failed utterly. The Principal Hazard Management Plan failed utterly to prevent this explosion from occurring. Why didn't the audit pick this up? I don't know the answer, but I hear some speculative possibilities. The first one is that the audits were not done. I just don't know whether that was the case. Perhaps they were done, but the auditors failed to sound the alarm. Perhaps they actually did tick a box saying, look, we're non-compliant here, or at least requires improvement. Those are the kinds of judgments that auditors are often required to make. We're not compliant or requires improvement, but nothing was done. Perhaps senior executives had not been alerted to this finding and the significance of these findings. I don't know. But the requirement that the mines have a principal hazard management plan for explosions, a centrepiece of the regime, failed. I think the inspectorate has something to answer for here, because I don't think they really take their principal hazard management plans as seriously as the legislation requires them to do. So companies need to organise themselves to take those plans seriously. So my question then is, how can you be sure that your principal hazard management plans are not failing in the way that the explosion management plan for Grosvenor had failed? The last thing I want to talk about is organisational structure. Safety depends on your technical functions, technical people doing the right thing and sounding the alarms when it needs to be sounded. And safety is compromised when technical functions, engineers, are decentralised. What do I mean by decentralised? Well, the question is, who do these engineers answer to? Do they answer to more senior engineers and more senior engineers up a line? Or are they answering to low-level production managers, and are they therefore forced to fit in with the priorities of those low-level production managers? And if that's the case, then they're going to find themselves disempowered, unable to do what they know is right, because they don't have the power or authority to bring that about. So decentralised means, first of all, where working engineers answer to relatively low-level commercial managers. And secondly, it means where higher-level technical managers have no formal authority at lower levels. Now, this is what I mean by decentralised organisational structure. And what we find is that in so many organisations that have these big accidents, they've been operating in this way, ways that systematically disempower the working engineers and also disempower the senior technical people, because they have no authority, no real authority. They're only advisory, no real authority further down the organisation. And tragically, companies only finally understand the importance of what I've just said when they themselves have a truly major accident which threatens the commercial viability of the whole operation. So Boeing, I'm studying Boeing at the moment. Boeing is one of these. Those accidents that I mentioned have really threatened Boeing's whole viability. For example, it led to Boeing falling behind its arch rival Airbus. and Airbus is now the largest manufacturer of these passenger aircraft in the world. It's replaced Boeing because of these accidents which happened. And these accidents happened because the engineers working in Boeing were answering to low-level commercial managers who were pushing to get these aircraft certified and out to customers as soon as they possibly could, regardless of the true state of safety of those aircraft and those plans. So what Boeing did after this event was centralise its engineers, so the engineers report to higher level engineers, ultimately up a chain to a chief engineer who answers to the CEO. And the beauty of that, of course, is that those concerns that the engineers may have will be represented at the highest level. The CEO, who's sitting on the management committee, top executive committee of the company, has the ear of, the chief engineer has the ear of the CEO in that way and can raise those matters. All right, let's go back to Anglo. Anglo then had a decentralised organisational structure. So this is my attempt to diagrammatise the structure at the time of the accident. I'm dealing here with Anglo-American's Australian business unit. Above that is the Anglo-American Global Corporation, and it has various layers of organisational layers above. But I'm talking here only about the Anglo-American Australian business unit, the metallurgical coal mining companies. So their main line of control was down the centre of this diagram, down to a head of underground operations, a Grosvenor general manager of Grosvenor mine, an underground mine manager, and shift managers. That was the line, that commercial line of control operating in the mine. This is familiar to all of you, I suppose. Where do the technical people fit in? Well, at the bottom right of that diagram, you'll see three technical people. They're not, their relationship was rather confused, so that's why this is almost a circular diagram. But there was a ventilation officer and a ventilation and gas superintendent and a technical services manager. These people answered to the underground mine manager. They were appointed by the underground mine manager. Their careers were determined by the underground mine manager, their likelihood of promotion, their success within the corporation would depend upon the extent to which they were able to satisfy the commercial needs of the underground mine manager and the people above him. So they were co-opted, corrupted by that organisational structure. Then we also have on the top right here, we have the head of technical services of Anglo-American Metallurgical Coal. There's a dotted line down to the Grosvenor mine manager because that's not an authority line. The Grosvenor mine manager is not reporting, does not report to the technical services manager. That is a line of advice only. So that is a system which disempowers the technical services head. And indeed, there's an example of this in relation to the explosion where the head of technical services had made a recommendation to Grosvenor Mine as to what it should be doing, and that recommendation was initially accepted but then ignored and thrown out because it was going to take too long. So in other words, the recommendation, the head of technical services had no power, no authority to insist on what he was recommending. And the ventilation officer at the bottom, I think ventilation officers are really very important in all of this. They're the ones who know what's going on. And if they are occupying these entirely disempowered positions, you can't expect them to have much effect. And certainly the ventilation officers at Grosvenor felt very disempowered by their organisational location. So what I would like to see in a company like this would be something like reorganisation like that, where you've got the local technical people within the mine. There's certainly still, there's a connection between them and the underground mine manager. The dotted line is there. But that doesn't represent a formal reporting line. They are provision of services. These technical people are providing services to the underground mine manager. but they are reporting up a separate line to the head of technical services. That's where their futures are determined. That's where their performance agreements lie. That's where their bonuses are determined. And that's what gives them power and authority. And if they are aware that something is amiss and the underground mine manager is not responding to them, they can go straight up to the head of technical services and make their point of view known. And that's a way in which that point of view is then can be presented almost straight away to the head of the organisation, and that's the person who needs to make the decision, not some lower level commercial manager who's under enormous commercial pressure to generate the profits and production that the company wants. By the way, another example of what I'm talking about is BP, and with its Deepwater Horizon accident in the Gulf of Mexico in 2010. This was an accident that it killed 11 people, and it cost BP upwards of $65 billion. It nearly destroyed the company. They had to sell a lot of their assets after that accident. The reason it happened, the fundamental reason, is because the engineers who were doing the drilling were absolutely under the control of commercial managers who were seeking to maximise the speed of drilling. The speed of drilling was the ultimate performance agreement, which they were all measured by, nothing else. And BP recognised that this was a problem after the event and reorganised themselves in the way that I've just described. So, question there is simply this: is your technical function as influential as it needs to be? What organisational changes might be made to give it greater authority? And if you want some advice, I would suggest you focus on the ventilation officer and what level of power or influence does that individual have, and what can be done to enhance the authority or the influence of that kind of individual. You have to get down to that level of detail to really get an understanding of what I'm talking about. The ventilation officers, I've had various interactions with them, and anecdotally they are very disillusioned about their role and the willingness of the company to listen to them. Okay, so I've asked a series of questions there. I've put them all together in the last slide in my presentation. If you want to get hold of those, I suggest you can get hold of my presentation from the organisers of this conference, Meg Peacock. I think many of you would have been in touch with her, but she has this presentation and she can email it to you. I'm perfectly happy for that presentation to be emailed to anybody, and so please do so. But if you have any kinds of comments on the last points I've been making about organisational design, I'd be very interested to hear about them, either in questions or if you want to email me, my email address is there. I'm happy to engage in a conversation with you that way if you'd like. So, thank you very much.